All right. And now I'm going to share my screen to the actual presentation. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this is the thought organizer that you all should be downloading onto your devices. And now I'm going to switch to the actual presentation. Can you all see this okay? I don't know if people could do like a thumbs up emoji or something like that, or just speak with a booming voice or a soothing voice, preferably. I can see it.
I can see the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, Ash, for sending the link again. I appreciate that. Okay, so hello, welcome to this breakout session. I'm super pumped that you're all here. Our topic today is ways to cultivate a neuro-affirming student organization on campus. My name is Dr. Chris Truong, and I am a staff psychologist at the Counseling Center. And I'm also the coordinator for Neurodiversity Affirming Services for the center. And I'm trying to push and create a more neuro-affirming campus all over. So welcome. This is our slide, and the image here is that infinity symbol. I put it there because it is currently the chosen symbol for neurodivergent people. And the slogan that's attached to it is diversity with infinite variations and infinite possibilities. Okay, so we're going to start off with what's our outline for today. So if you notice throughout this presentation, there's going to be some blanks. And so when I speak about it, I'm going to put in the answer on the actual slide, like type it in, and you can also fill it out on your note taker. And if you need me to slow down or if you need me to repeat something, feel free to ask, and I'd be more than happy to clarify. Also, I understand you've been on Zoom basically all day. So I completely understand if you need to take a break, you need to stand up, stretch, do whatever you need to do to take care of your bodies. That's completely fine. So back to the presentation. We're going to be covering what is neurodiversity, what is neurodivergence on college campuses, and what can we do, both on an individual level and then expanding it bigger to a group context like your student orgs. Okay, so what is neurodiversity? So as you see, there's some blanks there. I'm going to start putting in some answers. So neurodiversity is a term that was coined in 1998 by sociologist, I'm going to type it in, Judy Singer. And this term was created to promote equality and inclusion of neurological minorities. It is a subset of biodiversity, and it refers to the diversity of human minds and neurocognitive functioning. So ultimately, the idea is all around the world, there's so many different types of diversity, right? And it naturally occurs. So neurodiversity is a part of this very natural overall umbrella of biodiversity. Now, after looking at this term, we're going to focus a bit on the neurodiversity movement. And so this movement was created and it kind of came to be because a lot of people felt that individuals who hold like a neurodivergent identity weren't being met with basically acceptance and affirmations, and basically they were being rejected or facing a lot of ableism through society. So within the umbrella of the neurodiversity movement, there are some core themes or core ideals that we hope to promote in order to make the world a better and more inclusive place. So one of these ideals is there's no correct way of thinking, there is no correct way of learning, and there is no correct way of behaving. And as a part of that, brain differences are not viewed as inherently pathological or as deficits. So oftentimes when people walk around and they hear about someone who is neurodivergent, sometimes because society has programmed us to think like this, they view these differences as a problem, and it's something to be fixed. But the neurodiversity movement is trying to counter that by saying this is not a problem. This is actually a part of who we are, and something that we need to make space for and accept as part of a natural variation in society. So while we're viewing neurodivergence as an identity and also like a set of strengths, it's also important to acknowledge the challenges that are associated with being neurodivergent, because there are both sides to that too. And if we ignore the challenges that are associated with this identity, then we are actually dismissing and invalidating a whole group of people, because the world is not built to support naturally neurodivergent people, because it's an ableist world. So I just wanted to check in if there's any questions about this. And if you have a question, feel free to type it into the chat. Right now, I don't see anything popping up, so I'm going to just keep scrolling into the next slide. All right. So I kind of touched upon this in our little preview, the previous slide about the neurodiversity movement. But as a part of that, there's a general large shift moving from the idea of neurodivergence as like a problem towards neurodivergence as an identity. So a lot of people in history has viewed neurodiversity under this model called the medical model, right? It's a common model that's being used in like hospitals or like doctors' offices. And so under this model, it views neurodivergent people as having forms of pathology, so like a problem that needs to be either prevented, treated, or cured. So as you can see, this type of framework or approach of viewing people can cause harm. So now there's a shift to the social model of disability, and that means there's shifting the term of disability to viewing it as something that's not inherent to a person, but instead it views it as a condition created by an environment that is not sufficiently accommodating or supportive. So that's a huge shift, right? Because it changes from, oh, the individual's the problem, they need to fix things themselves, or we need to cure them, we need to treat them, to shifting it to the bigger context of our world, right? A lot of aspects of our life and our society and our workplaces, schools, homes, that isn't built to have the proper supports or accommodation for disability, and also for neurodivergent people. Now, on this bottom here, I put a little asterisk because it's also really important to note. Neurodivergent can be associated with disability, and it can be associated with mental illness, but they are not the same. So that means a person can identify as neurodivergent, but they can also say like, hey, I'm not disabled. Or they could be, oh, I'm neurodivergent, but oh, I don't have a mental illness. So they're not the same thing. They can overlap if a person like chooses to disclose that, but we can't make that assumption. So I think that's super important. All right. So I've been throwing around a lot of terms being used here. And I thought it'd be helpful just to give like a quick glossary of vocab terms, so we could know the difference between all these things that I'm saying. So like we covered in the beginning, neurodiversity itself, it is the natural diversity of the human brain. Now, the next term, neurodivergent, that is having a type of mind that functions in ways which diverges significantly from the expected societal standards of normal. And so this term was coined in 2000 by Cassian Asasumasu. And this is different from neurodiversity, which was coined by Judy Singer. Another term that you may hear being used is neurotypical, abbreviation, sometimes people say NT. And neurotypical is basically the other end, right? So having a neurocognitive functioning that falls within the expected societal standards of normal. So the way that the world is built today, a lot of folks and a majority of folks may identify as neurotypical. And those who don't fall into that, they would be neurodivergent. Another term here is neurotype. It is a term used to describe a type of brain. So one type of neurotype is neurodivergent and another neurotype is neurotypical. So that's kind of like the mini umbrella that those two terms fall into. And this last term, I thought it was really important to talk about because oftentimes a lot of people use it incorrectly, and it is neurodiverse. So it is a term used to describe a group in which multiple neurocognitive styles or neurotypes are represented. So it's used to highlight multiple people or a group. So like in this diagram, here is a neurodiverse group. Here, the blue person, they're neurotypical, and these two figures here, they're both neurodivergent. And there are two different types of neurodivergent. There is a neurodivergent person with ADHD, and then there's a neurodivergent person with epilepsy. So altogether, it is a neurodiverse group. Oftentimes, people would use neurodiverse in substitution of neurodivergent. And so I think it's just important to have accurate terminology and at the same time balance that with individuals who may actually identify with the term neurodiverse more than neurodivergent. So if you run into someone, they're like, oh, I'm neurodiverse. You don't need to feel the need to correct them because that's how they identify themselves. And by correcting them, that actually invalidates who they are. All right, so that was a lot of terminology. I'm going to pause again for any questions that may pop up. All right, so I'm going to keep going down. Okay, so there's a question, right? So what's under the actual neurodivergent umbrella? Because it's a huge term and there's so many things that fall under it. Oftentimes, people, when they think of neurodivergence, they're just like a top three that pops up. It's like autism, it's ADHD, and it's maybe like a learning disability, right? So those are very well-known conditions that may fall under the neurodivergent umbrella, but there's so much more. And so there's other examples on the screen. So it can include things like an intellectual disability or developmental language disorder, epilepsy, bipolar, OCD, traumatic brain injury, sensory processing disorder, and so much more. So the bigger idea is under the neurodiversity movement, the term neurodivergent just means you have a different brain or you have like a different way of thinking or a different type of neurocognitive functioning. And that's okay. And so if you feel like, hey, I may fall under this neurodivergent umbrella and you might not have like a formal diagnosis or you feel like, oh, I'm not sure, that's okay too, because the movement promotes acceptance. And so I think it's a really good resource to think of for community. Anyways, down here in the highlighted yellow / orange, neurodivergence can be one, it can be possibly genetic or innate, or two, produced by a brain altering experience or a combination of the two. So there's no set way where neurodivergence is, I guess, that exists. And there's so many different ways it can happen. So we're just having some openness for that. All right. So now let's talk some numbers. An estimated, it's actually pretty big. So I think that's important to know. 15 to 20% of the world's population exhibits some form of neurodivergence. And this number can be due to advances in diagnoses, awareness, and accessibility to steadily increasing numbers of people able to get access to these diagnostic services. But at the same time, we also need to take into account this number may be an underestimate because there are a lot of barriers that exist in the world that can prevent someone from getting like a formal diagnosis, like financial barriers, not having health insurance, maybe there's stigma within their families or communities that prevents them for even embarking on this path for a formal diagnosis. So about 15 to 20% is high. It could actually be higher. And since it's such a high number already, it means there's going to be also a lot of neurodivergent students going to post-secondary institutions like ours, right? Going to college. So with all the numbers aside, all the history aside, and all the terminology aside, let's go to the heart of it. What does that mean for us? So ultimately, that means there's a high chance that you have already interacted with or will interact with someone who is neurodivergent. So knowing that we're going to encounter neurodivergent people in our lives no matter what can we do? How can we do our part to create a supportive, affirming, and accepting community on campus? So I like to take it from a human perspective, right? Basically, whenever you interact with someone, anyone, try to lead with kindness, right? Lead with respect and lead with patience. So I can throw at you all the tools and strategies in the world to create a more neuro-inclusive org for you and also to be a more neuro-affirming person. But ultimately, I think it boils down to these three traits. If you're able to incorporate them in your behaviors, your mindset, and your approach with others, I think that's just already going to make a huge difference. Okay, so ultimately, like I said, it starts with us. And once we start working on ourselves and reflecting on ways that we can shift the way we think about other people and the way we act with other people, then we become leaders and we become models in our orgs to show to other people, okay, we can start a new culture that would circle around acceptance and affirming other folks who are neurodivergent. All right, like I said, mindset. There are some things that maybe we need to shift about how we think about things. All right, so here are some 4 points that we can consider as ways to shift our mindset. So the first being, let me get the term. Understand that neurodivergence by itself is not a flaw, it's not an illness that needs to be fixed or corrected, right? So this is the challenging the medical model of viewing neurodivergence. Next ideal would be recognize that neurodivergence can come with its own set of strengths, and these strengths definitely can and should be fostered, but also at the same time, acknowledge any challenges that can come from the disabling effects of neurodivergence if they are present for that individual person. I'm typing it out. And then refrain from shaming others, judging others, or bringing unnecessary attention to behaviors simply because they're not neurotypical, especially if these behaviors aren't harmful, because that just further isolates other people in this world. And finally, take our own steps to be aware of possible biases and learn about neurodivergent people and culture. So these are 4 big ways that we can kind of reflect and shift our mindset in order to take that next step, which is now altering some actions and strategies. All right, so the next set of actions have to deal with our environment and also being aware of the various sensory concerns a person can have. So in this first box here, there's like an image of a concert, and then like there's like icons for like sound, light, like smell, and movement and touch. So ultimately, I'm going to put a little text box here. Be aware of the various sensory needs related to lighting, smell, sound, touch, and movement. So not just neurodivergent people. I think everyone has various levels of sensitivity to there's actually 8 senses. So beyond like sight and smell, touch, taste, we also have like interoception, which is our ability to know things like if we're hungry or if we're thirsty. And there's also like vestibular, which is our sense of balance. So some folks, they may be hypersensitive in these domains. So when they, for example, hear a sound, it might feel a lot louder than another person may hear it. Um, or people may actually be hyposensitive in these domains, which means they may need extra additional stimulation in order to help them feel more grounded and feel more calm. So that's where when people maybe they may access like a fidget, right, when they're sitting. So this is inputting some like movement and some stimulation into their life and to help them stay calm in that way. And now in the right-hand box, there's like a picture of like a calm body of water and a fidget itself, icon of a chair and a very calm brain. And so ultimately, it's the idea of when we are creating spaces or when we're in our club, for example, for club meetings, maybe it'd be helpful to provide access to regulation tools like fidgets, or give a variety of seating options. Maybe just sitting in a chair, this doesn't do it for someone, and maybe allow people to stand up, get up and down, move around, take a walk around the room, but not make it like a shaming thing. And also the provision of like calm areas. Like sometimes meeting or group spaces, they can be very overwhelming, especially if it's extremely crowded with people, it's really loud, it's kind of chaotic. So being intentional and maybe creating a certain part of the room, a certain part of the event where it is a little bit more calm and like a chill zone, where like it's like widely understood that, hey, if you just kind of need to disconnect a little bit from the group, you can go to this area, sit down, scroll on your phone, do an art activity, decompress, and then when you're ready, you can come back. And just having that available for folks to use and also not judging them if someone is needing that access. And this calm area could not only just benefit neurodivergent people, but it could also benefit people who have social anxiety, maybe people who are maybe more introverted and they just want this some alone time. Um, and also people who are like just they want their own space, but they still want to be connected with others in the room. So there's a lot of benefits to making sure there are calm areas wherever you are. So that's the first set of actions that we can take and be mindful of to create a more neuroaffirming space for your org, but also in other spaces beyond your organization. Next, another set of actions is to actually be mindful of your own assumptions that you're making of people based off what you observe they do, and also being mindful of individual preferences. So when you interact with someone and they respond in a way that's different, it's actually very helpful to don't assume deliberate breaking of rules. So like, for example, you're having an event and there's a sign-in table and there's like a whole line of people waiting to like check in into your sign-in sheet. And then you notice someone kind of just like get away from the line and they try to enter the room by themselves, right? They seem kind of like they're in their own world and just doing their own thing. Don't assume that they're purposely breaking the rules and they just want to cut in line and just want to have huge disregard for everyone. Maybe instead they're feeling overwhelmed when they're standing in line. Maybe they actually are confused and they don't know what is the process that's acceptable to sign in, or maybe they need extra support and maybe they may benefit from someone from your org, going up to them and like checking in, hey, how are you doing? Welcome. Do you need help checking in? And then approaching them with that patience and kindness and understanding and respect, that could help diffuse any tensions or, I guess, resentment that might come from you if you see someone doing something different from someone else. In conjunction to that, don't assume rudeness, right? So, for example, you may be having a conversation with someone, and then suddenly someone erupts and they just start going on a huge tangent about like their own story. Oftentimes when that happens, a lot of people assume they're really rude, or they assume that like they're so self-centered and they're being selfish and they're just like taking over the whole conversation. Actually, it might not be like that. They might not even be aware that this may come off as rude. Instead, it might be a bid for connection. They might be so excited that whatever you're talking about relates to them or sparks an interest in them, or they want to add to your story. And so they can't help but to interject and add their own experience too. So by opening up the way that we interpret these interactions, it could actually also diffuse the tension within ourselves and help us to respond kindly to that person in that moment. So if someone interrupts, they go on their story, you could say something like, "Oh, thank you so much for sharing. Like, I appreciate you adding to the story." And then you can go back to your story or find another topic that brings both of you into the group conversation. And then finally, it's really, really important to ask for individual preferences. So for how a person identifies and how they want to be supported, because not everyone is the same. Not everyone's going to take on the label of neurodivergent, for example. Some people might not take on the label of disabled, but they may be neurodivergent. So for like, there's a whole spectrum of ways that people identify themselves. So we don't want to assume or label them for them. And also everyone is different. So you just ask like, hey, what specifically can I do to help you feel welcome today? Right. And then we could take that into account as well. All right. So I'm talking a lot, giving a quick pause to see if anybody wrote anything in the chat. Looks like no. Okay. So now, another set of actions is the way we actually communicate with each other with like language, and like the pacing and our expectations of others when we hold a conversation. So here are some questions that I put on the left-hand side that we can consider to reflect on to see if they're actually ways that we are implementing our own biases that is a barrier for other people to connect with you. So one question is, hey, I'm noticing that there's some disconnect. Maybe would it be helpful if I said it in a different way? Is there any way that I could actually be more clearer or more direct in this conversation? Or can I expand my way of communication to include different communication styles, right? So not all communication is verbally based through spoken word, right? Maybe we could incorporate other types of communication like written, sign language, images, body language. There's so many other ways that we can expand connecting with each other while in a group setting. So like, for example, if you ask the group a question and everyone is like raising their hands to share ideas. There may be people who might communicate better through written means, right? And so in addition to having the option of people raising their hand to answer, maybe in the background, the screen, you can have people kind of write in their thoughts on a shared Google Doc projected on the screen, for example. And so you could attune to what people are thinking, but also not add a pressure for everyone to respond in the same way. And then that intersects into that last point. Am I able and open to other types of nonverbal communication? So looking on the right-hand side, there's some blanks. So it'd be great if you could allow for different pacing of conversations and reactions. So that means like, let's say you're having a conversation with folks and the conversation's going light speed, like, okay, yeah, I'm picking on that really quick. This person's responding really quick. And then we hit someone in the conversation where it seems like they're lagging, right? Like their response, it takes longer than normal. Normal, I say in quotes because it really isn't normal. Longer than other people in the space to respond, right? Oftentimes when this happens, there's like a sense of shared discomfort, and then people will kind of like ignore that person, skip over that person, cut them off, just so like the flow of the general conversation could keep going. But when that happens, it actually is really painful and isolating and dismissive. So being mindful of that, and if you notice someone may need a little bit more time to respond, being patient to wait. And it's okay to let the conversation pause a little bit for them to share their full thought. Or if you notice they need more time to think of a response, then you could say, hey, so and so, I noticed that you have a thought. Would you be okay if we came back to you in like a minute or two to see what you think? And then you can ask them for for permission for that. And so that helps them still feel seen and still feel included in the group conversation and included in the community. Um, the next blank with the different eggs, try to avoid using indirect expressions, metaphors, or sarcasm. There are some people where like it's hard to pick up on sarcasm, or like if you say a joke, it may not land the same. And oftentimes when that happens, they're actually super shamed for not getting it immediately. Or asking like, wait, what does that mean? Can you explain that joke to me? And that makes them feel very embarrassed, and also disconnected from the group. So ideally, if you could, maybe you could avoid using indirect expressions, metaphors, or sarcasm, or if you do use them, be open to explaining what you mean. If someone's like, "Oh, hey, sorry, I don't get it. Can you like explain that further?" Then, not shaming them for asking for that additional way of explanation. And then like I said, no, using multiple forms of communication. And finally, clarity and conciseness. Sometimes when we talk, we say things in like very long run-on sentences, or like it's a compound question where we add multiple things tagged on. And it can be hard to keep track of what exactly that we're saying or what we're asking for. So if there are ways that we can just make it more concise or be patient to repeating ourselves or be patient to cutting it into smaller sub questions and waiting, that can also help improve the experience of communicating with each other too. So I'm gonna do a small check-in, look at the chat. Okay, it seems like no questions yet. All right, and then another set of actions that we can do. I see someone typing HU in the chat, but I'm not sure what that means. So if you'd like to clarify, feel free, but oh, hi. Okay, hello. Um, welcome. So, actions, increasing the flexibility of, I'm going to copy, body language and talking style expectations. So what this means is um, not everyone operates on the same vocabulary for body language, right? So maybe in our society, in the US, westernized US, there are actually expectations of, a good example would be eye contact, right? So sometimes if you don't give like a certain amount of eye contact, then people may judge you. They may think that you're being rude or that you're feeling disconnected or you're bored, when actually it's none of those things. It's just really uncomfortable to maintain eye contact, or it's overstimulating, or if you look at someone's eyes, it's really hard to focus on what they're saying. So increasing your own flexibility and accepting when someone doesn't want to make eye contact with you, and not taking it personally if they're looking someone else, and making space that, oh, they're still listening. So that's an example of flexibility. And then also talking style expectations. People talk in different ways, right? Um, for example, so there's like a little bullet point in this list here, narrative style. That is a type of talking style where basically a person, they prefer to connect with others through sharing their own stories. So for example, you may be telling a story about, oh, how I went to the store and I got myself a chocolate milk. And then suddenly someone jumps in, they're like, oh my gosh, I went to the store and and they start talking their whole other story, like jumping on another train or another direction. Um, and it kind of seems like it's centering the story back on them and not on you. So oftentimes when that happens, people feel kind of annoyed, or they feel frustrated, or they feel like, oh, you're not listening to me, you're self-centered, right? But in actuality, it's a type of talking style where they feel this is their way they show connection to you. They have a shared topic which is you both went to the store, for example, and they feel so excited to share that aspect of them, and they're sharing their own experiences as a way to show empathy to you. And so knowing that, we may be then building more flexibility within ourselves when we hear someone go and their own narrative style, tell their own story, know that, oh, they want to connect with us on a different level and they're trying to show in a different way that they understand and they want to empathize with us. And then working from there. So there's a whole list here that I put as different ways to show this types of flexibility. So like I said, eye contact, facial expressions. There are some people who just don't naturally make facial expressions, right? And if they are like having like a very straight face like this, very flat, they may be criticized. They'll be like, why aren't you smiling? Why do you look so upset? Like, are you mad at me? And that may make them feel, again, isolated and different. And actually, if they force themselves to smile or force themselves to show certain facial expressions that are socially accepted, it actually makes them forced to mask. And masking can be really harmful to folks. Masking could be really exhausting, and it can lead to like a lot of performative actions. And ultimately, if someone keeps masking for a really, really long time, it could even lead to like depression, anxiety, burnout, meltdowns, and also like a loss of the sense of self. So any way that we as a group and a community can reduce the pressure to mask and create safe spaces for people to just exist naturally the way they are, the better. Also flexibility for body movement. So like when I said earlier at the beginning of this meeting, I was like, hey, if you need to get up and you need to take a walk and stretch, go for it. That's an example of modeling acceptance and flexibility of body movement. So even if we were an in-person space and we're all sitting at a table and someone just gets up and starts walking around the room, I'm not gonna draw attention to them. I'm just gonna let them do what they need to do and trust that they are trying to do what they need to focus and be a part of this space. And I'm going to trust them to pace in a way that they'll come back when they're ready. Similar to here, too. And you could also do something similar in your group spaces as well. Using fidgets or allowing people to do other tasks at the same time as we're talking. Some people, they can listen so much better and remember so much better when they're doing something on the side. Like some people may be like playing like, I don't know, Snake, or I'm so old saying that, but like a game on their phone. And that actually, or Tetris, and they could remember better and attend better to what you're saying. Like I said before, interruption, narrative style, info dumping. That's another type of communication style. The best way to describe it as if you're having a conversation with someone, and let's say we're talking about cats, and then that person just starts going in like immense length, detail, excitement, and energy about cats, how much they love cats, how many different types of species of cats there are, how many cats they have in their lives, whatever it is. They just start like info dumping about their passion or their love. That is actually a sign of positive connection, right? So I know sometimes when people start info dumping on you, some people may get actually annoyed and they'll be like, oh my gosh, they're like taking so much time. They're not giving me space to talk. Maybe if we could approach that with a more kind and more positive approach and be like, hey, this person is info dumping. That means one, they trust me. They trust me to an extent that they're going to share their passions with me. And two, oh, wow, they want to connect with me on this level because it brings them so much joy. And they're hoping to bring me joy too by sharing this. So see that reframe of perceiving what's happening and how it can kind of shift the acceptance and the affirmation of that conversation. Um, and then, like I said before, asking to repeat what's said. So if someone doesn't quite understand what you're saying, like, hey, can you repeat that? Repeat it. It's not like um, a personal offense to you, or they're not like challenging you or anything. They legitly may just need to have the thing repeated. And then this whole segment here, stimming and tics. So I don't know if you all know what a stim is or what a tic is. But some people, a lot of people actually have them on their regular lives, normal day basis. So a stim is repetitive body movements or repetitive movement of objects. So some examples that you may have seen may be like hand flapping, finger flicking, humming, spinning, rocking, maybe like rubbing items between their fingers. These are some examples of stims. And stims are they mean different things, but sometimes when people see another person's stim, they might like panic or they might get worried or concerned and they're unsure of what to do. Like they're just noticing this behavior and they don't know if like that person needs help or like they need to come to them and check in or if we need to ignore it. They're not sure. So if we actually expand our flexibility of what communication can include, um, this is where stims can come in. So stim is actually a part of communication. People sometimes stim to regulate their stress levels or to cope with the demands of the situation. So it's a form of self-regulation, which is a good thing. Otherwise, it might lead to like a meltdown, for example, if they're not able to stim. Or it can also be a type of expression for like celebration or joy. So sometimes maybe they're extremely happy. You might see someone stim, and that's excellent because that means they're having an awesome, awesome time. So if you notice a stim, you don't need to immediately go like, oh my gosh, 911, everyone laser focus on this person and bring a lot of unnecessary attention. You don't need to do that. Just note it in your brain, be like, okay, yeah, that person's stimming. Awesome. And then trying to decide, is it stimming out of like happiness, stimming out of like, oh, they just need to like self-regulate? Cool. And then just like like little by little, take data and observe like if they actually need more support. Oftentimes people don't. And I also want to put out there a caveat that like not everyone's the same, right? So everyone stims in different ways. And so we can't have that many preconceived notions of what a stim may mean. So include that openness of, the actual situation on hand. All right. Any questions? I'm going to look at the chat. No. All right. Okay. So here are some reflection questions. Things to consider when we're noticing there may be a disconnect or we're trying to reflect on ways to make the place or thing or conversation more neuroaffirming. If there are instructions or guidelines that you're giving to your group, are the guidelines clear enough? Maybe would the person benefit from a different way of sharing information? So like verbally, you might be given instructions, but maybe a person may benefit having it written too, or having it shared ahead of time so they can have the time to process it on their own. That's an option too. Is more time needed to process and respond? Are we meeting people where they are at? Um, it can be really hard when we have all these sets of expectations and we're placing it on someone, and then we get mad when they don't meet those expectations. And it's really unfair because like in those moments, the person may not be able to reach these expectations without supports or understanding. And so we're kind of just kicking them when they're down. So we need to be mindful of like, okay, where is this person right now? And how can we meet them there? And pace ourselves similarly so they feel accepted. Are we interacting with them in a strengths-based way versus a deficit weakness-based, right? So like an example would be info dumping. A strength-based way of looking at info dump would be like, oh, wow, this person is expressing joy and they want to connect with me in a positive way. A deficit weakness-based way of looking at info dump would be like, okay, this person is really weird. They're taking up too much time and they're taking up too much space and they are just ruining the vibe of the conversation. So you can see there's like different reframes here of how to interpret behavior. And then finally, are we checking to see if our response is due to our own biases? So like challenging our own norms of like the correct way of an action. So like, is there really a correct way to make eye contact? Is there a really correct way to smile? A correct way for like taking turns in a conversation? Not really. So we shouldn't be acting as if there was like one way to do things and then punishing people or isolating people, rejecting people, shaming people for not meeting that. Okay, I'm gonna check that again for questions. Okay, it seems like we're pretty good. Now we covered a bunch of options for you, right? To change the way we think, the way we set up our spaces, the way that we communicate with others, and the way that we also embody these affirming practices on an individual level. And so now we can talk about expanding it to group settings like your orgs, right? How can we fuse what we just talked about and what we just learned into a larger level, and how do we model it? Because we are leaders, right? So like a part of the responsibility of being a leader is not just like the organization logistical aspects, but also like how to model being like an awesome human. At least that's what I'm hoping. Um, okay, so here I just included suggestions and examples of ways that we could expand it to your group level. And so on your sheet, it just has all listed there. But I also added some space on the bottom for you to like think of your own ways of adapting it for your own group. So again, space and environment. So one potential way of changing things to make things better for your group space would be making sure your check-in procedures are accessible. So including like written and verbal, maybe a computer ways check-in. Also, maybe changing it up, like instead of checking in as like a large group, saying like for attendance, like I'm here, maybe just checking in on an individual basis to reduce overwhelm. Of course, checking their environment for like the lighting, like is there like a way to like dim the lights a little bit so the big light doesn't burn our eyeballs? Or like, is there an option to sit on the floor versus sitting in a chair, a couch, or standing? Temperature, is the place too hot, too cold? Are there like alternatives for people to get some relief if they feel uncomfortable through their temperature? And then sound, like, is the space super loud? And if it is really loud, are we creating a space where it's okay for people to put on headphones to just like kind of mute it a little bit and not shame them for it? Like I mentioned, creating of a chill zone or a calm space, and also just being mindful of like spacing. So like if you're in a classroom and like we're packed like together really, really close, like a tin of sardines, that could be really uncomfortable. So is there a way that we can shift the way that we're configuring our physical bodies so that it allows for more breathing room and more space for people to feel comfortable and less overwhelmed, and also less overwhelmed like sensory wise too? And then here I wrote different group opportunities. So we can bond with each other in so many different ways. Like we could have a large group discussion with everybody, or you could even structurally build in opportunities to maybe have people talk in pairs or groups of four, one-on-one, and kind of shaking it up a little bit. So then you give a more comfortable and predictable way for people to connect on a different level and not feel overwhelmed. This topic here, communication and pacing. So it's a lot of what I've mentioned before. So the use of written and verbal communication, flexibility of conversation and pacing, and also patience. Inviting the use of, I didn't mention this, but there's these things called communication cards. So sometimes when someone is feeling very overwhelmed or anxious, they can actually turn inward and become withdrawn, and then they don't speak. But they still there is still a need to communicate even if they don't speak. And so that's where communication cards could be a good support to help kind of figure out how can we meet their needs during this moment and this time where they aren't able to speak. So communication cards could be as simple as yes, no, so that like when you ask them a question, they could hold up one of those options. It could even be stuff like, I need a snack, I need water, I need a break, check in with me later. So there's like a whole bunch of options, like default responses that people can just easily identify, pick up, and use. And so it reduces the demand for people to like answer a million questions when they're feeling stressed. Also, for these communication cards, you can even, instead of words, use images. So use like a picture of a water bottle as opposed to saying the word water. That could also be helpful too. And for bonding activities, infusing more structure into it. So like having like games that have rules that are simple, or like if, for example, if you're having a mixer, I like to do this thing called spin hour. Spin being short for special interest, but ultimately a spin is a shared, it's like a huge passion, right? So for spin hour, what I do is I give people kind of like a name tag, and instead of writing their name, they write their passions. And so then that gives a little bit more structure of people to like look around and be like, oh, you also like orange juice? Cool, I like orange juice. Let's talk about it. Right. So you can see building in that structure can remove some of that awkwardness, to break that ice or break that initial contact and just jump to go to the heart of bonding. Um, Create opportunities to connect through shared passions, like I mentioned, interest, and maybe a theme. I know there are some groups that do like to do like mini TED Talks or like mini like presentations to small groups, and they love it. So that can be an option too. And of course, be direct, specific, concise when asking questions to the group. And then finally, access. So like access to having like regulation and stress relief tools. It could be a fidget, it can be like snacks, it can be water, it could be the ability to go out on a break and come back and go for a walk. Any of that, just making it available and easy. Providing instructions and an agenda ahead of time. Some people don't do well surprises, right? And so if you can provide something before your meeting, like, hey, today we're going to meet and talk about these things, that might be helpful. Or like, hey, we're gonna play this game. Here are the rules ahead of time, and send that out. And so people can look at it and like figure it out. And if they have questions, they can ask you. And so they don't feel embarrassed if they don't get it immediately, for example, when you meet as a group. And then why not build in decompression time for your whole group during meetings? Maybe you could dedicate the last 5 to 10 minutes to all like just do coloring pages together, or maybe doing like stretch time together, all going for a group walk, breathing exercise, something so we all can feel grounded together, but not feel shamed if like someone needs to do it by themselves, right? So that's like the idea of like promoting a universality of any of these things. So anybody can do it, not just neurodivergent people. So I think that is basically the end of this workshop slash talk. And so I'm going to stop share. Oh, great question. Was there a sign-in sheet for the session? Well, I wasn't given one. And are you supposed to sign into something to get points or like credit? Okay, cool. So it seems like as long as you sign into the summit itself, you get your credit. So for this particular session, no. All right. Question. What are some ways executive board members can manage their own stress, social battery, and emotional communication needs when leading a club meeting? Oh, that is such a great question because you're right. How can we foster an affirming environment if we're also not being affirming to ourselves and our own needs? Um, Thinking about it off the top of my head, what I would recommend is I'm hoping that your exec board members, like there are multiple of you, and then like when you're planning the meeting itself, maybe beforehand having like a dedicated time to strategize and be like, hey, let's do a check-in. Right now, if we were to rate 1 to 5, 1 being like I'm exhausted, battery is dead, 5 being like I'm fully recharged, I can lead everything, can we just share where we're at? And then everyone shows their number, like I'm a 3. And then ultimately what happens is the person who's the highest number will probably naturally be the one to be more of the leader in that time and space. And the ones who are the lower ones can take a more of a background role to recharge. So that's kind of a way to kind of see, okay, this is how, oh, bye, thank you for coming. This is how we can kind of meet each other's needs by being knowledgeable of where we're at. Other things though is maybe you can build in decompression time or build in relaxation time in the actual meeting itself. So while it plans for something for your members to do, you can also do it too. So it's like double dipping or like it's benefiting two things at once. Um, and then Also, I'm wondering if maybe there are ways that you can rotate between board members. Maybe there can be like a role that's kind of just like, I'm taking a break for this week and you just on vacation. So maybe they could have a rotating vacation role for each week. And so everyone will have a built-in, think of a sports bye week essentially, to take care of yourself. Oh, bye. Thank you. Um, all right. So I think we're heading towards time. I don't know. I think you need to be out by like 55. So I'm going to be here. But if you need to head out, feel free to head out. But if you want to stay and keep talking and brainstorming with me, feel free. I'm here. I'm just so glad you're all here. Oh shoot, I'm so sorry. Yes, go. 3:45. It's my fault. Blame me. Thank you. Bye. See you. Of course.